Okay, welcome. This is the lecture for week 10 of Understanding Contemporary Environmentalism, and today we're going to be talking about militarism and imperialism in environmentalism, focusing on the ways in which these practices sneak into our green behaviors. In her article on the militarization of Kruger National Park, Elizabeth Lundstrom points to the difference between militarism and militarization. Militarism, she suggests, is the ideology that privileges military culture and values and paves the way for an expansion of those values into all spheres of civilian life. Militarization is an extension of this as the practice and mobilization of this ideology into specific outcomes within the state. Militarism, in other words, is a cultural phenomenon that establishes a justification for the expansion of the military, which results in the militarization of that country. So, for her part of the rise of green militarization then comes from a broader acceptance of militarism within national cultures, especially in the context that she is talking about, but certainly elsewhere as well, and we obviously can see this in a number of cultural phenomenons throughout North America. Now, her work builds upon an investigation of the ways in which our ideas of political loyalty shape the broader national culture, especially the idea of banal nationalism. Kruger National Park is deemed valuable in her study, not just because it has half of the remaining global population of rhinos, but also, she argues, because it is connected to a larger sense of national identity for South Africans, and the protection and securitization of the animals in that park is then seen as the protection of something specifically South African. Thus, the protection of the rhinos is a national object or a national goal, a patriotic act, even though it has nothing specifically to do with the nation. So this becomes a sort of extension of banal nationalism. Banal nationalism is the everyday representations of the nation which tend to build a shared sense of community or belonging within that country. It is in opposition, or it's, sort of a concept in opposition to the overt forms of nationalism that are specifically produced as patriotic acts, like singing the national anthem or saluting the flag or Canada Day celebrations or something like that. While those are specific, overt demonstrations of nationalism, banal nationalisms are almost more overlooked acts of national behavior, ones that become so commonplace that we take them for granted. Now, in Canada, of course, although we often think of our nation as something that doesn't have a strong national identity, we are actually sort of threaded through with acts of banal nationalism. Think, for example, of all the companies that use Canada as a reference point, from Canadian Tire, Petro-Canada, Air Canada, Tim Hortons, Labatt's, and Molson's. And then you could also think of our hockey teams, the Canucks, Canadians, Leafs, and even the fact that the Jets have borrowed from the Air Force in their logo. These are all forms of waving the national flag within our everyday life, but yet we also know that they're not actually waving a national flag, right? They're not actually moments of overt patriotism. They are simply a sort of recognition of the nation as an important part of our life. And as such, they bring with them a sort of shared sense of identity, but again, they're not overt acts of nationalism. So, banal nationalism expands the relationship between the citizens and the state into non-state representations and experiences. So when we go to Tim Hortons, we are often and implicitly asked to engage in the sort of shared sense of Canadian identity. And when we do this, or in doing this, we see two things happening. First, we see the reinforcement of the shared belief of the national community, that without these shared experiences, it becomes harder to identify as a group. Second, we also see that this kind of banal nationalism adds a quality to these identity, that these brands have imparted onto Canada different ways of thinking about that national identity. That is, they have an impact upon what it means to be Canadian. And so in this sense, there's a sort of give and take between banal nationalism and sort of overt patriotic acts. Now, nature, as we know in Canada, can really be a pretty significant feature of banal nationalism. If you look at any of the representations of Canada through ads for any of these sort of companies, from beer and coffee and gas or hardware, it doesn't take long for us to see visions of mountain lakes or green forests or frozen ponds. In fact, wilderness, as we have seen, is often given national meaning in Canada or elsewhere. And this is particularly the case for national parks, which have a sort of certainly formal national connection to them, but are still part of this everyday sense of a shared representation of the nation. So in this practice, the natural space becomes loaded with meaning, whereby it takes on more than just an experience of that space, and instead becomes a symbol of the country. Going to Banff National Park, then, becomes a quintessential Canadian experience. This is the perfect example of banal nationalism, as the state gets folded into our everyday experience outside of our interaction with the state itself. So for Lundstrom, the banal nationalism of Kruger National Park has loaded the landscape with the potential to become securitized and militarized. So she points to the initial sort of evacuation of people and the dispossession of that land from the people who used to live there as a sort of moment in which the state officially interrupts into the sphere of the park. But that interruption makes it into the landscape that it is today, a landscape that is prime territory and a safety haven for many of these animals, rhinos, of course, being one of the ones that she's focusing on here. Then, second, as part of a sort of moment of banal nationalism, you have a tendency to blame people from outside of the country for the problems within the country, building a sense of solidarity within the country. And again, this is not seen as a specifically patriotic act, but rather it's a form of everyday explanation of why things happen in this area. And then third, you have the sense of crisis that unfolds around rhinos and their diminishing populations, and an experience of these rhinos as specifically national objects, right? These are things that need to be protected on behalf of the nation, as opposed to simply protected for their own selves. Now, these features get folded together to bring the arms race to the landscape of Kruger National Park. But what Lundstrom wants us to recognize is that these features gets constructed as natural and inescapable, when in fact there might be other options, and in fact the landscape itself is very much a socially constructed space. For one here, Kruger is a social landscape on a political and colonial border between South Africa and Mozambique. The dynamics of this poaching problem in the park, then, are certainly partly an outcome of this social set of histories, right? That poaching is certainly an outcome of political circumstances around poverty, around colonial borders, and around current inequalities between Mozambique and South Africa. Second, then, you have the militarization of conservation that then pushes an increasing militarization of poaching, which in turn rises the price of illegal game, which then causes the cycle to continue. And the poverty that enables the risks being taken by poachers allows for this sort of cyclical militarization that is naturalized in the landscape as simply, the fact that there are a lot of rhinos there will inevitably draw people to want to poach them, even though that's certainly a set of economic and social histories that lead to that circumstance. So while it might seem like militarizing the conservation practices in these spaces is the only option, by thinking about the ways in which the practices are shaped by a culture of militarism and banal nationalism, Lundstrom suggests that we could certainly think otherwise. And this is where she gets to at the end of the paper. Now, Lundstrom's paper is very detailed on Kruger National Park, but the work that she's done on militarizing conservation has been extended into a number of different spheres, and even in Canada, we can see this. in one of their yearly Arctic military exercises, the Canadian military often plays out a scenario in which there is a boat carrying toxic substances in the Arctic, and the military needs to come in and seize that boat and protect the Arctic from potential damages. And this is backed up by a set of legislation called the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, which is very much a sort of sovereign tool as opposed to a sort of conservation tool like it might be seen given its focus. This picture is of Stephen Harper looking on awkwardly during one of those operations in the north, called the yearly operations called Operation Nanook. Now, in the second article, we're introduced to the idea of green grabbing, which is an example of what we might call banal imperialism, or a form of imperialism that is built into more commonplace values. Now, it was common under colonialism to dispossess local populations of land. We have a campus for the University of Manitoba on Treaty 1 territory, and that treaty is in fact very much a living relationship of that act of dispossession. And these acts of dispossession were central to the value of colonialism. They existed throughout Canada, of course, and other colonial landscapes. And part of that is because land was and still is a valuable resource for empire building, as it contains objects and activities that can be commodified. Now, land grabbing is a more contemporary version of the removal of local control over land through investment, particularly, or by a company. In this practice, instead of the state doing it overtly, as was often the case within sort of formal colonial relationships, there is instead a process put into place by which a domestic or transnational corporation gains ownership over that land to be put into commodity production, or perhaps more accurately, to be put into a new form of commodity production. The most sort of classic example of land grabbing that we've seen in recent decades is the acquisition of agricultural land in the sort of tens of thousands of acres at a time for new crop production. And in the 2000s, this was certainly the case for biofuels, which then became a more significant commodity. And a number of companies started to plant crops for fuels instead of for food, which led to a sort of run on food prices and sort of significant problems in food security for a number of people who used to depend on that land that gets put into production for fuel. Land grabbing, like colonialism before it, is often engaged in, quote unquote, for the good of the local region. That is, it's enabled by governments who see large-scale investments into that region as a sort of stimulus that will bring money and technology into the area, and then thereby increasing the development. What often happens, however, is that these investments are focused upon export, and the region is given very little back, and sometimes, in fact, left with significantly damaged landscapes. And so people have sort of pointed out this practice of land grabbing as dispossession by investment, where local control gets taken over by foreign investment or even sort of more centralized investment and not regional investment, and they lose authority and sovereignty over that land. Now, because of this, critics suggest that this imbalance of power is very much imperialist in nature. It operates through a set of symbolic concerns for the local region, but is in reality built upon the benefits for a foreign company or land. Now, in that second reading, we're introduced to a new form of land grabbing, which they call green grabbing, because it is an appropriation of land for environmental purposes. Green grabbing preserves land, often by removing it from the circuits of local production, at the desires of a non-domestic population. The land, importantly, is not just put into a preservation state in which it's not used and it's just left unproductive, but is actually turned into a commodity within that sort of preservation mode. The most common example here is the establishment of carbon credits, where a forest is left standing and thereby allowing carbon to be used elsewhere in the world in different carbon markets. But this also happens in other ways, especially around producing tourist experiences for ecotourists, or setting aside land for sort of forestation swaps. So the little video that you watched on the RED program through the UN is one of those examples. Now, I don't think I need to say too much about this, as I'm sure you're all familiar with how this can be imperialist. But what I do want to say, to tie this back into the discussion of banal nationalism, is that both the militarization of Kruger National Park and the production of green grabs are built upon an environmental agenda that pushes those outcomes forward. The discourses of contemporary environmentalism are, in fact, at the center of both of these practices. And this is something pointed out in the article on green grabbing, in which they talk about the sort of ways in which the discursive production of the environmental crisis or the environmental degradation is central to the commodity production involved in green grabbing, that the commodities that come out of green grabbing can only exist through the discursive landscape of the environmental movement. As such, it is worthwhile to think of these examples of these practices as being involved in the production of environmentalism as banal imperialism, in which we justify the intervention into other regions and even the violent intervention into these regions through the concern that we have for the future of those regions. And this becomes a sort of justification for imperialism. And if you ever sort of look at the history of colonialism, especially sort of contemporary colonialism, it becomes really apparent that most colonial nations and most colonial practices are never justified based upon a sort of overt form of discrimination. Rather, they're justified on a kind of altruistic ground in which the colonizer is doing something for the colonized, in which their approach to the land, their form of dispossession will, while it may be hard at the start, only be good for the local population in the end, that we are, in fact, as colonizers, sort of doing them a favor. Now, in environmentalism, this brings up a lot of questions, but one that I think is worth talking about is that of crisis, and how our sense of urgency overrides other concerns or lets them slip away unnoticed. In the case of Kruger National Park and the green militarism that we sort of have ended up adopting a sort of shoot on sight principle, certainly is a sign that there becomes some concerns that are overridden in the goal to maintain rhino populations. Now, this is something that we'll talk about in class on Tuesday, but it will also certainly be a matter to be discussed as we move into thinking about the Anthropocene in the next set of readings. So that's it for this lecture.